You know, if it's not about sports, I find it very hard to concentrate.
Hey, what is up guys, Braden here, and today we are going to talk about the hockey team owned by the Mob that Wayne Gretzky's brother played for. This story can be traced back to 2004 when an expansion team was founded in the United Hockey League, which was once a minor league before it ultimately folded in 2010. The team was owned by James Galante, a garbage disposal mogul who gave the league $500,000 in exchange for a franchise. The team was based in Danbury, Connecticut and was given the name Danbury Trashers in reference to Galante's garbage disposal businesses. Galante named his 17-year-old son AJ, a high school student at the time, president and general manager of the organization. AJ was a high school hockey player and after suffering an injury was told he could no longer play hockey. AJ's father James, by his own admission, was not a hockey fan nor a sports fan at all really, but felt bad seeing his son so depressed at losing his hockey career. This is what prompted James to buy the franchise for AJ in hopes that it would lift his son's spirits, and it certainly did.
Crazy how life goes. Until I met you, I always thought
AJ Galante was a huge fan of the movie The Mighty Ducks and the movie Slapshot, two all-time classic hockey movies, and so he decided to use these movies as a blueprint for building his team. AJ was also inspired by the theatrics of the Attitude Era of the WWE in the 90s and the early 2000s. He was a huge wrestling fan and he wanted to emulate that culture with his hockey team. And so in a mishmash of all three, he got to work and began to put together his squad. The team was actually founded on April 1st of 2004 to be exact, and so many people thought that Jimmy Galante was pulling an elaborate April Fool's joke by putting his young son in charge, but alas, they were incorrect. AJ Galante indeed was in charge of this newborn team and would continue his general manager duties even after graduating high school and enrolling in college. But AJ wasn't the only one who wanted his team to be a bunch of troublemakers with attitude. His father Jimmy also wanted the team to be bad boys, the evil empire of the UHL, similar to the image the Detroit Pistons and Oakland Raiders once held. He encouraged his players to get into as many fights as they could. Jimmy said, quote, "I wanted tough guys on my team," unquote. And so a gang of tough guys were assembled, including Garrett Burnett, Ramon Nodur, and a guy named Brad Wingfield, who held the single-season record for penalty minutes in the UHL during the 2002 through 03 season. Nodur in particular was known as the Nigerian Nightmare, the first Nigerian-born player to ever play in an NHL game, and was known as an enforcer, or in other words, a guy who beats the hell out of people. AJ also brought in a few former NHL players, including none other than Gretzky. No, not that Gretzky, this one. Brent Gretzky, Wayne's brother, who played 13 games for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the movie Slapshot had brothers in it, and so AJ wanted brothers on his team too, bringing in the duo of Mike and Drew Omacholi. The head coach was Todd Sterling, who is the younger brother of the former head coach of the New York Islanders, Steve Sterling. UHL Commissioner Richard Brozel could kind of see what was happening. He made it clear to the Galantes that they would play by the rules and conduct themselves professionally. Brozel later said he thought AJ was just some punk kid and treated him like he was an unruly teenager rather than an equal colleague. The Hockey News predicted that the expansion Trashers would finish second in the UHL. However, during their inaugural season of 2004 through 05, they were basically playing about 500 hockey for the first couple months of the season, but then they went on a 7-game streak without a loss, which propelled them to first place in the UHL's Eastern Division. And you know that the bad boys of the UHL were of course brawling too. During a game against the Kalamazoo Wings, Brad Wingfield tried to fight a guy, and when the other player declined to fight, Wingfield attempted to skate away. But as he did so, the other guy stuck his leg out and yanked Wingfield backwards, which caused Wingfield to topple over and break his ankle. And by this point, everyone was at each other's throats, with Ramon Nodur actually attempting to kick a linesman. Nodur was ultimately given a 20-game suspension for this, while the Kalamazoo guy who broke Wingfield's ankle was only given a 5-game suspension. The fans of the Trashers were equally as rowdy, packing the 3,000-seat Danbury Ice Arena on most home games. They waved body bags when an opposing player got knocked down during a fight. They were called the most dedicated fans ever by some Trashers players, and this was demonstrated during a triple OT game in which the Trashers ran out of dry undershirts. The fans in Section 102 literally gave the shirts off their backs to the Trashers, who ended up winning that game. The Galantes might as well have been royalty in the town of Danbury, Connecticut. The fans loved them, the team loved them, and the community at large also loved them. But the team wasn't just violent and chaotic, they were actually pretty good. The team qualified for the UHL playoffs in their very first ever season. AJ Galante was proving himself to be quite good at being the general manager, as the teenager had personally assembled the team. He spent hours on the web before the season, reading scouting reports and emailing other GMs in order to secure the best possible talent. In school, he pretended to go to the bathroom sometimes, when in reality he would be calling other GMs to try to negotiate trades. The violence and fights continued, and in one instance, a player named Chad Wagner was being removed from the ice by a referee when he broke away from the referee's grip and skated towards the opposing team's bench, grabbing the other team's head coach. Two other Trashers players left the penalty box and attempted to join the melee. Wagner was ultimately banned completely from the UHL, while the other two players received 5 and 10 game suspensions respectively. The Trashers head coach Todd Sterling was even suspended for his inability to control his players. The game was the 16th time the UHL had to suspend a Trashers player. On February 23, 2005, WWE star John Cena attended a Trashers game against the Adirondack Frostbite. The game indeed was more of a WWE match than a hockey game, as the two teams combined for an insane 106 penalty minutes in just the first period alone, and 6 game misconducts were given in just the first 10 minutes. The Trashers would go on to beat the Adirondack Frostbite 4-2. The Trashers would later face the Frostbite again in the first round of the playoffs and beat them in 6 games. In the second round, they faced the Muskegon Fury, and their dream season came to an end, losing in 5 games. In the offseason, the Trashers replaced their head coach Todd Sterling with Paul Gillis, who had been the head coach of the Quad City Mallards the previous season. Sterling, however, would stay in the Trashers organization in a scouting and consulting role. They also acquired Mike Rupp, who had scored the game-winning goal in the 2003 Stanley Cup Finals. Rupp was currently out of a job because of the NHL lockout that was going on that season, and so he agreed to play for the Trashers while the NHL was still in a lockout. The Trashers started the 2005 through 06 season just like they had the previous, by playing just about 500 hockey, hovering around that mark heading into December. But just like the season before, they got on a hot streak, finishing the month of December without a regulation loss, going 11-0-3. They stayed hot for the remainder of the regular season and won the Eastern Division. In the first round of the playoffs, the Trashers faced their head coach Paul Gillis' former team, the Quad City Mallards. The Mallards had actually swept the season series with the Trashers, and so this opening playoff series would be a dogfight, and every player on Danbury's squad knew it. Danbury dropped the first 2 games of this series at home, but won games 3 and 4. The Mallards answered by winning Game 5 to take a 3-2 series lead and put the Trashers on the brink of elimination. But the Trashers would win the next 2 games, winning the series against the Mallards in 7 games. In the next round, they faced Muskegon again, the team that had eliminated them the year before. The Trashers had a 3-2 series lead heading into Game 6, and in a triple overtime thriller, the Trashers won to eliminate the defending champs. But the finals would present quite the challenge for Danbury. They faced the Kalamazoo Wings, who had not lost a single playoff game that year up to that point. Danbury lost Game 1 but rebounded to win Game 2, tying the series at 1 apiece. But unfortunately for Danbury, the Wings would win the next 3 to win the series 4-1. The 2006 offseason is where everything would fall apart for the Trashers and Jimmy Galante in particular. To start with, the Trashers had been circumventing the UHL's $275,000 salary cap. How were they doing this, you ask? Well, they were giving players and their wives no-show positions at Galante's various trash disposal companies and giving them housing allowance checks for amounts that had already been paid. The UHL estimated that the Trashers exceeded the salary cap by nearly $500,000. Todd Sterling himself was charged with wire fraud because of this and was given 5 years probation. But Jimmy Galante was involved with a lot more than just wire fraud. He was involved with the infamous Genovese crime family, a family of mobsters. The elder Galante was definitely up to no good, as not only had he spent time in prison when AJ was younger, but despite outward appearances, never really cleaned his life up. This time around, Jimmy was charged with a litany of criminal offenses, including RICO charges, conspiracy to extort, mail fraud, wire fraud, and witness tampering, and conspiracy to defraud the IRS, among others. On June 27, 2006, Jimmy Galante was led into court in New Haven, Connecticut. He quietly listened as the charges were read off, all 72 of them. The indictment document contained 113 pages. Prosecutors alleged that 4 times every year, a man named Matty the Horse Ianello, the head of the Genovese crime family, collected $30,000 from Jimmy Galante, and in return, the mob would make sure no other trash disposal companies operated in the area. But the interesting part came when 5 Trashers players were put on the stand to testify about the corruption going on in the organization, mainly the fact that the team had been circumventing the salary cap. Brent Gretzky was even called to testify. But none of these guys were really in trouble. Jimmy Galante was the one the feds wanted, and they would indeed get him. They had mountains of evidence, recorded phone calls, documents showing fraud, and witnesses. They had Galante on recording talking to other mobsters about hiring an associate of the mob to intimidate people they deemed to be enemies, including Richard Brozell. They had all sorts of stuff. And here's the thing about the feds, guys. They have about a 98% conviction rate. If the feds charge you with something, you're going down. And so, Jimmy Galante could see the writing on the wall, and he knew he wasn't beating this case, and wound up pleading guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the IRS and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He was sentenced to 87 months in prison and had to give up his ownership rights to 25 of his trash hauling companies. He also had to give up his house, 6 racing cars, a trailer, and over $448,000 that was seized by the feds. In the midst of all this, AJ announced that the Trashers would be shutting down operations. Trashers players were placed in a dispersal draft and selected by other UHL teams. Interestingly enough, that same year, their rival, the Adirondack Frostbite, also shut down operations, but their reason was far different. They just couldn't secure an arena lease. And today, a new team plays in Danbury called the Danbury Hat Tricks, who play in the Federal Prospects Hockey League, and they honestly have the coolest name and logo I've ever seen. I think I'm gonna get a Danbury Hat Trick shirt. Maybe a hat, too. In August of 2006, AJ, now 19 years old, agreed to give an interview to a writer for ESPN about the Trashers, but wouldn't talk about the criminal case involving his father. It was a depressing scene inside Danbury Ice Arena. The team store was desolate and empty, except for a few cardboard boxes that held some merchandise. The locker room was empty too, except for a lone skate sharpener that, funnily enough, was still plugged in. AJ talked about the Trashers with a hint of sadness in his voice, about his time as GM for a professional hockey organization. He talked about some of his favorite Trashers players that he had recruited, including the man who scored the winning goal in the 2003 Stanley Cup Finals, named Michael Rupp. They had gotten Rupp to agree to play for the Trashers during the 2004-05 NHL lockout. AJ seemed unfazed to approach an NHL player and ask him to join the Trashers, saying, quote, "We'd call anyone. My dad and I, our theory was that we all put on our pants the same way," unquote. He showed the ESPN writer a Donald Trump doll, saying, quote, "It was a gift someone gave my dad because he's kind of like Trump, except Trump doesn't get into trouble like my father does," unquote.
That one didn't age quite so well.
AJ recalled that at first people didn't take him seriously as a GM, but that he worked hard and he had fun. There was obviously a hint of sadness in this interview, but AJ is the type of guy that will likely be successful no matter what he does. He's charismatic, good-looking, and passionate about hockey. These days, he is the co-host of a hockey-themed podcast called Talkin' Trash. He's talked on the podcast about being the son of a mobster, owning the team, and just his life experiences in general. I highly recommend listening. All in all, the person I feel most bad for is AJ. Although he didn't face any criminal penalties, he lost something that he put a whole lot of effort into, that being his team. It's like when a YouTuber spends years building a channel and then the channel gets deleted by YouTube. It's sad to see. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you hated it, leave a dislike. But either way, comment for the algorithm. Peace out.
I can never ever find the right words, and there's no way this is real life. There's no telling you're the right girl, so I can only say that it feels right. It feels right, it feels right. Yeah, I can only say that it feels right. It feels right, it feels right. Yeah, I can only say that it feels right.